Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Abbott, and welcome to the webinar. I'm going to get straight in with some examples of everyday pricing. Before I do, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box, and I'll come back to them at the end. So imagine that you're a government minister, you're on the Today programme, John Humphreys has just nailed you with one of those awkward questions. How much do you typically pay for a price of milk? And with luck, if it's you that does the shopping, you'll know that it's typically between 80 pence and £1. If you're a wine drinker, like I am, then when I ask this question, lots of people would say that they typically pay somewhere between £5 and £10 for a nice bottle of wine. If you're a whiskey drinker, and I'm not, but my son is, then a nice 12-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey might cost something like £30. So there are three typical liquids that are found in most homes. A question that I usually ask the audience at this point is, what do they think is the most expensive liquid per litre in the average home? Now, I'll get lots of suggestions. A common one is bottled water. And I understand where they're coming from. Bottled water is tens of thousands of times more expensive than tap water, but per litre, it's not the most expensive liquid in a typical home. One of the better suggestions is perfume, which again is extremely expensive, but when I've costed it up, it's only half as expensive as what I've got in mind. And if you haven't guessed, what I'm thinking of is this stuff, printer ink. Now, if you were to buy the ink that comes inside the printer cartridge of most people's printers, if you were to buy that by the litre, just how much do you think you might pay for it? £100? £200? In fact, I measured the dimensions of the well where the ink sits and then multiplied it up so that I could calculate what a litre's worth. For the printer that I've got at home, if I were to buy the ink inside that by the litre, it would be £2,150. And that leads to the question, what makes that not 10% or 20%, but 70 times more expensive than the 12-year-old single malt, lovingly handcrafted Scotch whisky? And the answer is nothing. There's no absolute price for anything. There's no law of the universe that says one thing has got to be a particular price and another thing has got to be some other price. The price that we pay for something is based on a whole bunch of factors, and most of those are psychological factors, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. Now, a lot of companies, when they consider their marketing, and this is the traditional 4 Ps of marketing. If you're into marketing, there are a lot more than 4 these days, but these are the historic 4 Ps. Most organizations, they're pretty clear about what it is that they do, what the product or service is that they sell. They're usually pretty clear about how they reach their customers, what their channel to market is, the place. They've got a good idea of how to promote their product or service. They might be a little bit unsure as to what's the most effective, but they know what to do in terms of advertising or social media or a website or whatever. Price is often one of the hardest things for an organization to get right. It's one of the things that creates the most angst. Nobody wants to price too low and leave money on the table, have a lower margin than they could possibly have achieved. Nobody wants to price too high and potentially lose sales. But how do you get that price just right? So a typical approach that companies take is to use one of 2 methods. First is a cost-plus approach. So if you manufacture something, you add up all of the materials that go into the product, you add up all of the labour that goes in, all of the incidental costs and overheads, you come up with a total cost, you add on the margin that you want to make, and that gives you a cost. If you're a service company, it's very similar. You add up all of the office costs, admin, utilities, and again, at the margin that you want to make, you've got a cost. An alternative is to look at what the competition is doing. And organizations typically choose one of 3 positions. If they think that they've got a an advantage in the marketplace, something unique or something that makes them better or premium, then they might look at what the average price in the marketplace is and go a little bit high. If they've got some operational efficiency, some cost advantage, then they might go slightly low, try and beat everybody on price. Or just take the easy route out, just look what everybody else is doing and just match them on price. But the problem with this kind of approach is it's treating all of our customers as if they were all Mr. Spocks, that they were completely logical, and whatever price we put in front of them, they look at it and they say, yes, that makes perfect sense to me. I can say exactly how you've arrived at that. That's a very fair price. I'm prepared to pay it. In actual fact, every single one of us are Captain Kirks. And if you've watched the movies, and I clearly am a Trekkie and I have, in the movies, Spock is the one who's going, Captain, there's only a 12.2% chance that this plan is going to work. And Kirk is the one who's going, no, Spock, no, we're going to do this. This is going to work. He's working on something called heuristics here. He's using gut instinct. Heuristics is just a posh word for rules of thumb. And that's how we make a lot of our decisions. It's all the learned experience over our lifetime. It's the strange ways that our brain works. And in Kirk's case, as I say, it's this gut instinct. He just knows he's doing the right thing. That's all very well, you might think, if you're in a business-to-consumer market. But what if you're in a business-to-business market? Surely business customers are rational. Well, you'd like to think so. One of my clients, just 2 days ago, I was chatting to the commercial director. This is a company that sells a service into the public sector. And we were just talking about building relationships with clients, and one of the things he mentioned was a fantastic advantage when you do. Sometimes we then get the opportunity to write the specification for whatever it is that they're buying, and obviously if we help them to do that, we're in an excellent position to provide that service. Well, theoretically, that kind of thing shouldn't be happening, but when strong relationships exist, it does. An even better example, I was presenting this same topic to a group up in the Northeast, and somebody in the audience who runs a sales training company piped up with his particular example. He had a major client, a global client that had approached them to do some sales training. They went through the specification and they absolutely nailed it. They could provide every element of sales training that global company needed. And what's more, they looked at every territory where that global company had a sales office and found an associate who could deliver exactly the same structure and content on behalf of them. And they got down to the last two, but they lost it. And when they spoke to that global company, what the company said was that they'd given the business to a consultant that they were used to working with. This consultant was not a sales expert, they weren't a training expert. But what the company said was, well, he knows us and we know him, we're very comfortable with him, and he said that he thinks he can deliver this. So this person in the audience in the Northeast, they didn't lose it because of competence, they didn't lose it because of price, they lost it because of relationship, chemistry. Even in business to business, we make a lot of our decisions based on these non-rational factors, the relationship that we've got. So what we're going to explore now are 4 ideas where if we understand these heuristics, these rules of thumb, these mental shortcuts that we apply, if we understand some of them, then we can apply them to how we present our prices from a marketing point of view. I have to say this is all about the marketing element of pricing. It's how those prices are presented to the customers. This is not a negotiation presentation. So let's get stuck in. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is something called price relativity. And we'll go straight in with an example. Some years ago, The Economist was trying to get new subscribers. I'm going to zoom in on the important bit. They were trying to offer the online version of The Economist for $59, the print version for $125, or both together for Well, that looks a little strange. Also for 125. Normally, when you bundle two things together, in this case, the prices would add up to $184. You knock a little bit off, let's call it $179. That becomes the bundle price. It looks like the economist have made a mistake. And if anybody could add up, you would think it ought to be the economist. But in actual fact, they're being quite clever. If you go out and survey people and ask them, what would they do? Would they rather have the online-only version for $59 or what the economists actually want them to buy, the print plus online version for $125? Unsurprisingly, most people go for the online version, the internet version. And you can see why. Print plus internet is twice the price. What could you do with the extra $60 odd? You could go and have a nice meal, you could subscribe to something else. Do you want all of that paper cluttering up the home? It's only when you introduce print as an additional option that it changes. Suddenly, all the demand goes to the print plus internet version. Interestingly, nobody actually says that they would rather have the print-only version. They all go to the print plus internet. But it looks like an absolute bargain. If print is 125 and print plus internet is 125, that's a steal. Perhaps the economists have made a mistake. Let's get in quickly before they realise their error. So what the economists have realised there is that when we look at a price, we don't look at that price in isolation. That price is always compared with something else. It's either compared with a direct alternative, it might be compared with a substitute, it might be compared with some entirely different thing that you can also spend the money on. But prices are not looked at in isolation. So when you're presenting a price to your customers, one tip is don't just give them one price. Try and find a way of giving them more than one. As an illustration, there's an imaginary company here that produces some machine that does some clever thing, and customers come to them and say, we want a 6-colour printing machine. Great, it's £130,000. But they also know that the trend in the industry is to a more advanced paint. You know, it's helping people to sell more of their product if they've got this particular paint. And they also know that there's a huge throughput in these machines, and downtime is really important because for every hour that the machine isn't running, there's a huge cost to the company, and therefore remote diagnostics and predictive maintenance makes a big difference. So they know that there are other things that the customer ought to be aware of. It's relatively easy to come up with 3 different alternative prices for the customer and to put those 3 prices in front of that customer. Right, the second tip that we're going to look at there is something called price anchors. So what is a price anchor? An example of a price anchor is the price that you might be prepared to pay for a particular home. Now, I live in the north of England. When I go down to London and I look at house prices down in London, they look absolutely crazy to me. It looks like people in London, I'm amazed that they can afford to buy a one-up, one-down kennel to live in. Whereas somebody from London that comes up north, it looks like houses are so cheap, we're giving them away. We must all be able to live in a different house for every day of the week, and we're all living in gated communities. They are so cheap. We've each got a number in our head that represents what we think the value is for something. It's an anchor. The interesting thing about anchors is they can be completely arbitrary. Some research was done where a group of people were asked to bid on 6 items. It doesn't matter what they are, there were just 6 arbitrary items. This was a blind auction, so they had to write down exactly the maximum amount that they were prepared to pay, because 1 penny less and somebody else might get it. They could not see what everybody else was bidding. And the only thing that they were asked to do before they wrote down those prices was to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number or national insurance number in the top corner of the paper. And this is what happened. Those people whose digits were in the 0 to 19 range, they were prepared to bid a range of prices between around about £9 up to about £16, £17. Those people whose digits were in the 20 to 39 range, they were bidding somewhere just over £10 up to about £37. All the way up to those people whose digits were in the 80 to 99 range, they were bidding from about £20 up to about £56. Now that's utterly mad. The only thing they did was write down a completely arbitrary number in the corner of the paper, and it influenced the amount of money that they were prepared to pay. The BBC, demonstrating something very similar on the Horizon programme about 4 or 5 years back called How We Really Make Decisions, they had a guy walking along a riverbank with a bottle of champagne, asking people what's the maximum amount that they were prepared to pay for the champagne. But before they answered that question, he got them to pull a ping pong ball out of a bag where he said there were 100 of them, numbered 0 to 99, pull the ball out, tell them what the number is, and they asked them, would you be prepared to pay that amount? Of course, he was telling a fib. They didn't have a bag with 0 to 99. He had 2 bags. One bag was full of the number 10. One bag was full of the number 65. Those people who pulled a number out of the 10 bag, the range of prices that they were prepared to pay varied from about 10 up to, well, £7 up to £15, £20. Those people who pulled a 65 ball out, they were prepared to pay from about £40 up to £80. Just a completely random action, pulling a ball out of a bag and reading out loud the number, and then making a decision about that number, influenced how much people were prepared to pay. So how might this work? I was talking to an audience of people in retail. It was a carpet presentation about this. When you go into a carpet shop and you decide to buy a carpet, then one of the things you have to do is decide on the underlay. And typically, the underlay options will be presented like this, from the least best underlay up to the very best underlay, left to right, because we write left to right, from £2.99 a square yard up to £9.99 a square yard because we counter. It's the logical way to do it. So I said, why not put them on the wall the other way around? And somebody in the audience came up to me afterwards and said, I did exactly that a year ago. Before I did it, the most popular underlay that I sold was this red one, $4.99, the 9mm PU foam underlay, $4.99 a square metre. I made that change, and the most popular underlay that I sold was the 11mm sponge, $7.99 per square metre. Because now, instead of anchoring on the lowest price and comparing everything else to that, they were anchoring on the highest price and comparing to that. So my fictitious example, Acme Inc., when they're quoting on this machine, let's put the most expensive option first. And there is another thing about presenting 3 options as well. There is one of the heuristics, one of the shortcuts we mentally take is when we see 3 options, we tend to go for the middle one anyway. If you can provide more than 3 prices, great, and put the most expensive one at the top. If you can't do this, if you can't create an anchor, can you break anchors? If I were to ask you, what was the typical price of a coffee on the high street in 1997? Have a think about it. When I ask this question, a lot of people will say around about 50p, and that's my recollection too. Why 1997? And it's because in 1998, these guys arrived in the UK, Starbucks. And suddenly you weren't buying a cup of coffee anymore, you were buying a coffee experience. The language changed. It wasn't small, medium and large, it was grande and trente and venti or whatever they're called. You weren't served by a server, you were served by a barista. It wasn't just a kettle pouring hot water onto granules, it was a machine that hissed and spluttered and did all sorts of strange things. The whole thing changed. You were no longer comparing what was now a £2.50 purchase with what was previously a 50p purchase. So Starbucks didn't go up by 5%, 10% or 20%. They went up 5 times in terms of the average price of a cup of coffee. But they did it by breaking the experience. Another example is organic. There's no measurable difference between these 2 raspberries. If you do any spectroscopic analysis and look at the nutritional content, they're absolutely the same. There's an ethical difference if you care about how the land is cared for. From the farming point of view, it doesn't cost twice as much to do organic farming. But look at the premium. The price in the marketplace is almost twice. So they're breaking the anchor. Third thing that we're going to talk about is the power of zero, or free. A group of people were offered 2 chocolates. This was in a shopping mall in America. They were offered a luxury chocolate, a Lindt chocolate, which normally retailed for about $1. It was really, really creamy and tasty. They were offered that for only 15 cents. Or they were offered a Hershey's Kiss, which is a low-priced chocolate in America. I've personally never tasted one, but in every audience where I've asked this question, has anybody ever had one? Everybody that puts their hand up then pulls a face. So it doesn't sound like they are the premium end of the chocolate spectrum. And they were offering the Hershey's Kiss for 1 cent. And most people went for the Lindt until they knocked 1 cent off. And just because the Hershey was now free, suddenly the demand went to the Hershey. Now, if they made it 16 cents and 2 cents, 17 cents and 3 cents, people continued to buy the Lindt. It was the fact that it was free, it did something. Free shortcuts these internal processes where we do these comparisons. Now, you wouldn't apply free to your core product, but you can apply free to things that the customers value, but which are relatively low cost for you to deliver. So, for example, if you're selling a fluffy toy, and you might be selling this for £40, you can offer things like free delivery, free gift wrapping, free name certificate, free fur coat, free entry into a prize draw, free anything that customer values, but which is relatively easy and low cost for you to supply. Okay, fourth thing that we're going to look at is something called price versus value. Now, I used to run a company called CPC. We had about 80,000 customers. Every single week we sent a printed magazine to a sample of those customers. And the most important one was the first week of every month. The computer magazine went out to 60,000 of those customers. Generated a lot of our sales. We decided to do a test where we reprinted 1/3 of them were the outer cover, the inside and outside, front and back pages, which are the most important selling pages. So we reprinted the outer cover with lower prices. We did the third with the same prices that we'd had the previous months, and the third where the prices went up. What would you expect to happen? Well, if you've done economics, the short-run price elasticity curve looks like this. You'd expect if you decrease the price, sales would go up. If you increase the price, sales would go down. What actually happened was this. Where we increased the price, sales went up for the same products that people had been seeing in the same first week of the month for a number of previous months. Why? Well, part of it is because price communicates something about the value of what you're going to receive. My favourite strapline of all time, Stella Artois, reassuringly expensive. A higher price creates an expectation of a superior product or service. In a business context, it also provides some confidence. This was never a strapline, but for many, many years, decades, a common saying was, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. And what they were basically saying was, it's fine to pay a little bit more and to get a slightly less performance, but you know that if it's IBM, it's going to work forever and your job is safe. The price communicates something about what you're going to receive. The final and fifth concept that we're going to look at is something called arbitrary precision. There are 2 aspects to this. The first is some research that was done on how we assess the size of a number. Because we're all not Mr. Spocks, when we hear a number, our brains estimate the magnitude. Just how big does that number feel to us? And it turns out that the more precise a number is, the smaller it sounds. So 325,425 feels like a smaller number to our brains than 325,000. Now obviously, if you see them both together, 325,425 is clearly the bigger number. But in isolation, that precise number feels smaller than it really is. The other bit of research that I'm about to quote involves 27,000 house prices that were analysed in Florida, which is why there's a picture of a Floridian home. They had data on the initial asking price for the home and the final price that was paid. What they found was the fewer zeros there were in the price, in other words, the more precise the initial asking price, the closer the final price was to it. Or another way to express that is, the more precise the price was, the less negotiation and discounting took place. And you can imagine why that would be. Let's imagine you want a website. You walk into a web developer and you say, I'd like a website developing, please. If I needed to do X, Y, and Z, and they turn around and say, yeah, absolutely no problem, that's going to be £5,000. Well, that feels like they've stuck their finger, stuck it in the air, and gone, 5,000. And what they're doing is they're inviting you to say, I can come up with a number just as easily as you can. Why don't we call it 3,000? Let's talk. The more precise a number is, the more it sounds like there's some science behind it. There's a reason why it is what it is, and people are less inclined to negotiate. This is not only true for house prices, but there was an article in the Harvard Business Review where they looked at company acquisitions, and it turned out that exactly the same principle was at play. The more precise the initial asking price for the company, the closer the final price was. Now, I talked at the beginning about these concepts applying to B2B as well as B2C. If ever there was a B2B kind of marketplace, it would be the purchase and acquisition of a business. And it's one where there are large teams on both sides. There are teams of solicitors, teams of accountants. When you're valuing a business, you look at the asset value, the goodwill value, some multiple of earnings. There's a formula that both sides can follow and come up with something similar in terms of where they see the value. And yet, despite all of the work that goes into that initial analysis of the value, despite all the negotiation, the more precise the initial asking price, the closer the final price was. So applying that to our fictitious example, it's not 180,000, it's 182,660. It's not 160,000 for option 2, it's 161,870. You do have to be careful of making a price too precise. If the price was precise to the halfpenny, or in these days obviously the penny, if it was precise to the penny, you're going to be asked about that, and you will probably have to be able to justify it. And if you've got a spreadsheet that sits behind this that works it all out, that's great. But precise prices work better. So the 5 things that we've covered are these. Price relativity. People compare prices when they see a price. So rather than just give them one price and let them decide subconsciously what they're going to compare against, give them more than one price. Price anchors, people have a price anchor in their head, but anchors can be arbitrary. So one way to influence prices is to show them the highest price first, so they anchor on that, and they might go for the next one down. Or to try and break the anchors the way Starbucks did by stopping them from doing a direct comparison. The power of zero, finding 3 things that you can include which are low cost to you but are of value to the customer and do not impact your core product or service. Just trying a higher price. And I should add there, sometimes when you try a higher price, your sales might go down. But if your net margin has gone from 10% to 15%, you could afford for the sales to go down by 30% and you're still making more money. Don't just look at the top line when you're trying to assess the impact of a price. look at the net bottom line, in order to assess the impact. So sometimes just try a higher price. That communicates something about the value that's going to be received. And when you are putting a price in front of a customer, make it as precise as possible. So there's 5 ideas for you to go away and have a go with. Now I started by asking you, introducing some different liquids that were in most people's homes and asking what was the most expensive liquid in a typical home. Well, let's take that a little bit further. If I were to ask you what do you think the most expensive liquid per litre in the world was, what do you think you might say? And I'm not going to drag this out. It would be this stuff. To be fair, it's the raw material. It's not the Botox injection itself. It's the raw material, the botulinum toxin that goes into it. So if you're going to try and buy a litre of botulinum toxin, apart from MI5 and the CIA taking a distinct interest in your activities, apart from all of those problems, if you were to try and buy a litre of it, how much do you think it might cost? Well, it's 100,000. Actually, no. It's actually more than that. A litre of botulinum toxin would cost £100 billion. When this stuff is by far and away the most toxic substance known to man. So when you do get a Botox injection, it's largely water. There's very few molecules of the active ingredient. And when this stuff is sold, it's in the hundreds of dollars per microgram. But if you work it out, a litre of it would cost that. And if that doesn't demonstrate that there's no absolute price for anything, then I don't know what would. I hope that's been interesting. I'm going to just click on the questions and see if anybody has asked any questions during this. I don't see any questions. I'll hang on for a moment just to see if anybody has anything that they would like to ask. And if not, then I'll close the webinar down. Thank you very much for listening. No, I can't see any questions coming in which case I'd like to thank you again. So I'm just trying to use the, this is gunnercooke, and this is where you can find us. I hope this has been of interest to you, and yeah, have a great day. Thanks. Bye.